In 1843, there's a young nun. Her name is Sister Mary of St. Peter, and she is in Tours, France. She's a Carmelite nun in Tours, France. She is cloistered and is a postulant, so she hasn't actually made her final vows. But during this period of postulancy, she begins having these revelations from Jesus, the visits from Jesus and interlocutions both. So a visit from Jesus meaning an apparition where Jesus appears to her, and then an interlocution is when you hear the voice of God in your heart, in your soul. And so the very first visit in 1843, Jesus tells her that she should always honor both Jesus and Mary and never separate the two. Okay? There's visits that follow and continue until 1846 when the 29th communication comes from Jesus, and he warns her that there's an approaching storm. Okay, an approaching storm for the church and for the world. He calls it the malice of revolutionary men. Then in 1847, the following year, he names the group that's going to be the instigators of this great revolution. They're called communists. Now, she's a cloistered nun. First of all, in 1847, very few people had ever even heard of communists. They were a tiny splinter group. They actually did exist, but they were so small that in Europe at this time there were hundreds, if not maybe thousands of these groups. Europe was constantly in turmoil, and so the communists were not known, and certainly she had never even heard of this group called communists. So he tells her, oh, if you only knew their secret and diabolical plots and their anti-Christian principles. He then tells her that he gives her a special devotion. The devotion is got a couple of parts to it, but the main part of it is called the Golden Arrow Prayer. The Golden Arrow Prayer was this prayer that Jesus said, when you say this prayer honoring God, honoring my name, then it is as if you are shooting me with an arrow filled with love. And so he tells her, if you use this devotion, if you go to the Archbishop and you tell the Archbishop and he spreads this devotion among the people, you will be able to destroy this group called communists at the very beginning. Not necessarily kill them, but the activities that they're doing. Spiritually destroy them. So on March 29th of 1847, and then again 3 days later on April 1st, okay, Jesus warns her of the grave danger of this group. He calls them the enemies of the church and of her Christ. Twice he refers to them as formidable. He keeps warning her about this group. And though Sister Mary of St. Peter has met once with the Archbishop, she continues to try to ask for an interview or an audience with him in order to promote this devotion that Jesus is asking of her. Jesus is specifically telling her to go to the Archbishop and have him promote this devotion throughout his area and then beyond into all of France. Well, Jesus goes on to say that the storm is already rumbling. He says, pray for the church is threatened by a fearful tempest. And then he names both communism and atheism as the greatest of these enemies. Then on the 50th encounter with her, Jesus demands under no uncertain terms that she go to the Archbishop. She called for the Archbishop, and if the Archbishop is unwilling to come visit her, he has to at least send his representative. Okay? She tells this to her superior. Her superior gives the message. 2 weeks later, the Archbishop's representative shows up, and he sits down with her to have an audience. She tells him about the devotion again, about the impending danger for the church and for the world. And finally, the Archbishop's representative says, the Archbishop has no intention of honoring your request. He is not going to promote this devotion. He wants you to stop contacting him. She's devastated. This actually, in reality, the interview is contained in this book. This book is about Sister Mary of St. Peter. It's essentially what the notes that she took regarding these different revelations. This is one of my favorite books, actually. I love this book. It was a fantastic read. And you can get it from Tan Books or probably Amazon or a bunch of other places. The Golden Arrow Prayer is the prayer part of the devotion that we're talking about. He says, please stop contacting the Archbishop. And the Archbishop, the representative leaves. She says, I will be obedient to what the Archbishop has asked of me, and That's it. She says, I'm done. And so a few weeks later, Jesus appears to her again. This is the very last time. He's radiant in glory. It's the resurrected Jesus. He's beaming with light. And he says to her, you will soon behold my face in heaven. He tells her that she's about to die. She will die soon. And that her mission on earth has been accomplished, finished. She's done. So she's in good health. There's no reason to think that she's fairly young too, so there's no reason to think that she would die at any age anytime soon. But within about a month or so, maybe a few weeks, she develops pulmonary tuberculosis. And then on July 8th of 1848, she dies at the young age of 33. So at the same time that Jesus is appearing to her and telling her, warning her of this group called communists that nobody had ever even heard of before, really, Karl Marx is alive and well and writing the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto at the end of 1847, and what happened was the Communist League of London approaches him and asks him if he will write a constitution for their group. And he says yes. He writes it. He writes it in December and is finished by January of 1848. He delivers it to them. They read it and they say, "Hey, this is actually pretty good. We like this. We're going to use it." They pay him for it. The following month in February, they publish the Communist Manifesto, and a wave of revolutions suddenly appears in Europe that is the largest wave of revolutions in history. Now, if you go to any library in the country and you open up an encyclopedia and you read about the revolutions of 1848, you'll find that the encyclopedia says that to this day, social scientists don't know the reason why these revolutions happened. But in reality, we know that in the physical world, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? In the spiritual world, there's the same thing. For every action of some kind, there's going to be a reaction. So when we do a good deed, we know there's a blessing that follows, right? Well, when the Communist Manifesto was published, what happened was this wave of evil that spread through Europe. So the Communist Manifesto is about 50 pages long, give or take, depending on the size of the page that you print it on. I think it's very highly melodramatic text. As an English major, when I read it myself, I thought, well, I don't think this is actually very good writing. But it told the point of what Karl Marx was trying to get across. And following the publication of the Communist Manifesto, we have basically Karl Marx living a life of obscurity all the way until his death in 1883. He was not a well-known person. There are various people who come into humanity, and like, for example, Adolf Hitler, who was very famous. Everybody knew and saw that there was a grave evil going on with this man, Adolf Hitler. With Karl Marx, he was spreading these ideas, but he was completely unknown. He was a different kind of person. The Communist Manifesto states, we openly declare that the ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. It basically says what we want is a revolution. They're willing to destroy property, to kill people, to do whatever is necessary in order to make this revolution happen. Okay? So Marx lives and finally dies in 1883, and then the following year, in 1884, there's an amazing event that happens at the Vatican. Actually, I got to tell you one other thing that happens before that. There's a man, he's one of my favorite saints. Most people haven't heard of him, Anthony Mary Claret. He is a Spaniard who was made the Archbishop of Cuba. In fact, Cuba had kind of been, by this point in time, this is the 1840s and the 1850s, Cuba had already been, oh, excuse me, that was very loud. Cuba had already been evangelized by this point in time, but the church was not strong. There was a lot of corruption going on, a lot of terrible things happening, and he was sent over to straighten it all out, which he did. So the Cubans today love this man for having actually saved the Catholic Church in Cuba. He's an amazing guy. He was an exceptional preacher with incredible charisms. His body would become transfigured while he was preaching or in prayer. He would levitate up to 6 feet off the ground at times in front of credible witnesses. He stopped a series of earthquakes in Cuba by kneeling on the ground and placing his palms to the earth while uttering prayers. He could calm terrible storms by raising a hand to the sky and blessing the storm clouds. He experienced apparitions of both Jesus and Mary. He was even seen walking on water. In addition, a supernatural light that radiated from his body while he was saying Mass was seen by many people. It was so intense at times that one witness said he saw the light radiate from his body behind the altar all the way to the sacristy. Queen Isabella of Spain even produced a written statement solemnly declaring that she had personally witnessed this phenomenon. Okay, this guy is an amazing saint. I only gave you a short list of the amazing things that he did. He was really amazing. So he, just like Sister Mary of St. Peter, had apparitions of Jesus and Mary. And, well, Sister Mary of St. Peter only had apparitions of Jesus, but St. Anthony Mary Claret had apparitions and locutions of both Jesus and Mary. In 1859 and then again in 1861, he was told by Jesus and Mary that communism was the great foe of humanity, that they would spread evil throughout the world. Okay, he's also, just like everybody else at that time, probably had never heard the word before in his life, but he was exactly right. Okay, so what happens in 1884 is pivotal, and in fact, if you were reading Alatia, if you've ever seen the website Alatia, they had an article this week on this particular event. It happened on October 13th of 1884. So this date, October 13th of 1884, is pivotal. It's a really important date, and you'll find that as we go through this story, dates and events actually line up in certain ways. And it's kind of true. We've sort of been told about this spiritually before, but as humans, we haven't really grasped it that well. But this is one of those dates. It's kind of a pivotal early date in all of this. Pope Leo XIII, he's an awesome pope, has an extraordinary experience. He's at the Vatican. He's in his personal chapel, he has finished saying Mass, and he's leaving when there's this supernatural force that hits him and knocks him to the floor. He lifts himself up, he turns around to look toward the altar, and he hears the voice of Jesus and Satan in conversation. Okay? Satan, in a guttural voice, is bragging, boasting, saying that he is the victor. He is going to win and finally have the final victory over humanity. And Jesus, in a pleasant tone, disputes this. The devil says, all I need is more time and more power to those who have given themselves over to my service. Jesus says to him, how much time, how much power? And the devil says, 75 to 100 years and more power to those who have given themselves over to my service. And Jesus says, so be it. And that's it, it fades. The Pope gets up, he goes immediately to his personal, his office, he sits down, he takes a pen and paper out, and he composes the St. Michael prayer, the same prayer that we say at the end of Masses. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. If you've ever wondered where that prayer came from, this is where it came from. He was terrified, he knew there was a big rumble coming. But he didn't know, unlike some of the other people that we had, or Sister Mary of St. Peter, for example, who got more details, all he knows is we're in big trouble at this point. He said within a few years, the entire church is saying this prayer, St. Michael the Archangel. It's very important for us, and it's actually a powerful prayer. It's also used in exorcisms. Pope Leo XIII goes on to live a good life. He is of sound mind and body. There's no reason to believe that this event didn't happen, and he never retracts the fact that this actually did happen to him. Okay, so we move into the 20th century, and we find that humanity actually is becoming kind of arrogant, very, very self-confident. We've invented dirigibles, and then there's steam-powered engines, and then followed by airplanes and automobiles, and now we have factories that are doing the labor of human beings. To us today, that doesn't sound that astonishing. At the turn of the 20th century, it was amazing. People could walk into these buildings and find products being made without human effort. Machines doing these things. We began to become very, very self-confident. And in that self-confidence, we actually lost our sight of God. Okay? There, at the same time, were revolutions and actual persecutions of the church. In 1911, a persecution breaks out in Portugal. Okay? During the next 5 years, so 1911 to 1916, approximately 1,700 priests and religious are murdered. Now, Portugal is not a big place. I don't know where they got 1,700 people, priests and religious. But the religious property is confiscated, and a law is passed publicly for forbidding public religious ceremonies. Regarding the new law, the head of Portugal boldly declares, thanks to this law, Portugal within 2 generations will have succeeded in completely eliminating Catholicism. School children are obliged to march through the streets carrying banners that read, neither God nor religion. This is a pretty serious persecution for a little country like that. At the same time, we have humans building things that we think are showing our dominance over the world and over the universe. One of those is the Titanic. Okay, in April 12th of 1914, in April 14th of 1912, the Titanic is sailing from Southampton, England. It's on its way to New York City. It is unsinkable. Okay, the man who was the builder of this and designer of the ship, his name is Thomas Andrews, was asked by a reporter, is it truly unsinkable? And he says, not even God can sink it. So sure enough, it's sailing and it hits an iceberg on the starboard side. The iceberg is 100 feet tall. The rivets on the side pop, in flows water, and it took a bit of time before the people realized that we're not just simply going to float here until someone comes and picks us up. In fact, so sure were they that this ship was unsinkable that they only had on the ship approximately, I think it was 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsible boats. Who needs lifeboats when your ship can't sink, right? You just bob in the water and wait for someone to come get you. So on that evening, more than 1,500 people froze to death in the waters. There is another event that's coming up that's going to shake our confidence. And because the more confident we get, the less we think that we need God. But before that happens, there's a spiritual event that's really amazing. It's been approved by the church, just like Sister Mary of St. Peter's revelations, and everything, virtually almost everything else that I talk in here, the church has investigated and actually given its stamp of approval. This one is in Khrushchev, Ukraine. On May 12th of 1914, 2 months before the outbreak of World War I, 22 people are mowing fields in Khrushchev, Ukraine. They see an apparition of the Virgin Mary above the cupola of Holy Trinity Church. And she tells them, there will be a war. Russia will become a godless country, and Ukraine as a nation will suffer terribly for 80 years and will have to live through the world wars, but it will be free afterwards. Now, it's interesting to note, first of all, in this prophecy, that she talks about world wars. By that point in time, we had never had a world war. The term World War actually wasn't even started after World War I. They referred to World War I as the Great War. And then following World War II, they started calling World War I, and World War II, World War II. So she uses a phrase that actually hadn't been heard yet. And then the other thing is she gives a prophecy about what will happen with the Ukraine. We're going to see how that turns out. 2.5 months later, after this apparition in the Ukraine, World War I breaks out. It is devastating. We know the history of it. The history of World War II is more in our minds than World War I, but when you read the books of World War I, I'll tell you what, they were suffering badly. And it was devastating. It was devastating. So during the period of this war, while World War I is going on, in this little place called Fatima, Portugal, there's 3 shepherd children in 1916. This is prior to the visit of Mary. Okay, so they don't know they're going to have a big visit coming up, but they do have 3. Let's not call it smaller visits, but they're pretty amazing. But they have 3 visits from the Angel of Peace. Many theologians regard the Angel of Peace as St. Michael the Archangel because the guardian angel of Portugal was St. Michael the Archangel. Okay, so the Angel of Peace comes first in the spring of 1916. the three children are tending their flocks of sheep when a brilliant light appears before them, and staring into the light, they see an angel who announces itself as the angel of peace. Tomorrow is actually the feast day for the archangels, okay? During this first visit, the angel teaches them a new prayer and instructs them, pray thus, the hearts of Jesus and Mary are attentive to the voice of your supplications. That means that your prayers are actually very powerful. Use your prayer power. So following then, he admonishes them in the next visit and says, what are you doing? Pray very much. The hearts of Jesus and Mary have merciful designs upon you. Offer prayers and sacrifices continually to the Most High. Before departing, the angel instructs them, above all, accept and bear with patience all the sufferings the Heavenly Father will send you. Okay, the third and final visit, after teaching another new prayer, the angel offers Holy Communion to Lucia in the host, and then turns to the other two, Francisco and Jacinta, and offers them the chalice that has been suspended in midair to drink from. He says, take and drink the body and blood of Jesus Christ, horribly outraged by ungrateful men. Repair their crimes and console your God. When they finish this, the angel departs. Each time they have this enormous sense of peace and quiet, so much so that they can't even really speak. Days will go by with them hardly uttering a word because this sense of peace from this visit with the angel is so profound. So, meanwhile, as Europe is being torn apart by World War I, Pope Benedict XV is trying to broker a peace plan. He wants to stop the war. He designs a plan that will help to stop the war, and he sends this peace plan to the major warring parties, in fact, actually to many countries. And they're very basic. The peace plan is not anything other than each country will go back to its original boundaries and borders and things like that. Well, every country except one rejects the peace plan, and the war continues. So with his efforts, which have now failed, he turns to God for help, and he issues a public letter on May 5th of 1917, calling upon all the faithful to pray to Mary, asking for her intercession to bring peace to the world. He describes the war as the suicide of civilized Europe. He asks all to invoke Mary against what he calls the dark tide, calling upon her as the Mother of Mercy to come to us in our need. 8 days later, the prayers are miraculously answered. So it's a beautiful day, almost cloudless, in Fatima, Portugal. Okay, they're actually in a little place called the Cova de Iria. It's Portuguese, it means peaceful hollow or valley of peace. It's interesting how in our lives God designs things, and so when this big visit comes, they happen to be in this place called the Valley of Peace or the Peaceful Hollow. I've seen that in my own life, how God designs things, and I go, oh wow, God did that one, you know? So around noon, they suddenly see an inexplicable flash of light. To them, it looks like lightning. Boom, like that. But they don't know if it's a storm because it's clear outside. And so they stay and they wait and they continue tending their flocks of sheep. And then there's a second flash. And at that point, they scurry for cover and suddenly behold a spectacularly beautiful woman dressed in white standing above a small 3-foot holm oak tree. Lucia says she was more brilliant than the sun and radiated a light clearer and more intense than a crystal glass filled with sparkling water when the rays of the burning sun shine through it. The beautiful woman says to them, "Do not be afraid, I will do you no harm." The woman then tells them that she is from heaven and has come to ask that they return at the same time on the 13th of the month for 6 consecutive months. She adds that there will also be a 7th apparition later. So when she's finished, she says to them, "Are you willing to offer yourselves to God and bear all the sufferings he wills to send you as an act of reparation for the sins by which he is offended and of supplication for the conversion of sinners?" Lucia answers for all 3 of them and says, "Yes, we are willing." "Then you will have much to suffer," she says, but the grace of God will be your consolation. Finally, Mary says to them, pray the rosary every day in order to obtain peace for the world and an end to the war. And with that, she rises into the air and she glides off to the east and disappears. The following month, June 13th of 1917, Mary again asks that they pray the rosary every day. She says, Jesus wishes to make use of you to make me known and loved. He wants to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. I promise salvation to those who embrace it, and those souls will be loved by God like flowers placed by me to adorn his throne. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So the following month, on July 13th, this is one of the two major apparitions of Fatima. There's about 3,000 or 4,000 people there. Almost everybody is there praying the rosary on their knees. Can you imagine if we could do that here? Wouldn't that be amazing? So Mary comes and she speaks to them for a little bit, and then she opens up her hands like this, and the earth actually separates in front of them, and they look down and they see hell. Now, this is what Lucia wrote later about the vision that she saw. The rays of light seemed to penetrate the earth, and we saw, as it were, a sea of fire. Plunged in this fire were demons and souls in human form, like transparent burning embers, all blackened or burnished bronze, floating about in the conflagration, raised into the air by the flames that issued from within themselves together with great clouds of smoke, then falling back on every side like sparks in huge fires, without weight or equilibrium, amid shrieks and groans of pain and despair, which horrified us and made us tremble with fear. The demons could be distinguished by their terrifying and repellent likeness to frightful and unknown animals, black and transparent like burning coals. Terrified and as if to plead for succor, we looked up at Our Lady, who said kindly, "You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. If what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved, and there will be peace." Then she says, referring to World War I, "The war is going to end, but if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. When you see a night illuminated by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given to you by God that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions of the Church and of the Holy Father. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world." So in the first half of all of that, Mary is saying, if you do this, then this will happen. Then she switches in her language, and she uses what the English majors would call a declarative verbs, which is, the good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. She's not saying if anymore. She's giving the prophecy, actually. So after this discourse, Lucia is given what is commonly referred to today as the third secret of Fatima. Okay, this is it was part of a vision in which Lucia saw an assassination attempt against a future pope. In the visions, she sees the future pope making his way through a city when a hail of bullets and arrows pierce him and killing him. She is told that she has to keep each of these parts of the secret, of the vision's secret, which she does, but then later they are revealed, and that will come later on by Pope John Paul II in the year 2000. Finally, before ascending into the sky, Mary gives the three children a new prayer to be added after each decade of the Rosary. "O my Jesus, forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell, lead all souls to heaven, especially those who are most in need. This prayer then is added to the rosary. Prior to this event, that prayer which we say during the rosary, people they never said it before. So the August apparition is interesting to me because on August 13th, the children are taken captive by the local administrator of the government, and he takes them away so that they can't be present at the apparition. Crowds assemble, and in actuality, they will have their apparition on the 19th later privately. But on the 13th, with this crowd there, the crowd sees a cloud come down out of the sky, and then it rests on the holm oak tree. Let me read to you what happens, because it's kind of interesting, and it is another indication that God actually has us rely, just like at the resurrection, the majority of the people have to rely on the witness of a few or of a number of people that their testimony is true and that they saw the risen Jesus. The same thing with Mary. But in this case, in this particular apparition, it's kind of interesting because of what they see. Right after the thunder, this is a woman who's writing later on about what she saw. Right after the thunder came a flash, and immediately we all noticed a little cloud, very white, beautiful and bright, that came and stayed over the holm oak tree. It stayed a few minutes, then rose toward the heavens where it disappeared. Looking about, we noticed a strange sight that we had already seen and would see again. Everyone's face glowed, rose, red, blue, all the colors of the rainbow. The trees seemed to have no branches or leaves, but were all covered with flowers. Every leaf was a flower. The ground was in little squares, each one a different color. Our clothes seemed to be transformed also into the colors of the rainbow. The two vigil lanterns hanging from the arch over the holy spot appeared to be of gold. I've never read an interpretation of why this happened, except that we here living on earth can live in a paradise. It's possible that we can do this only if we amend our lives and we live without sin. Then the world actually becomes transformed into a place of beautiful harmony. That's my own personal interpretation. I've never read I've never read a theologian give an answer as to why these people saw this, but that's my answer. So during the September apparition, on September 13th, Mary repeated, as she did at every single apparition at Fatima, her instructions to pray the rosary every day. She also said that God was pleased with the children's sacrifices. Then finally on October 13th, 1917, more than 70,000 people traveled to the Cova de Iria to see the visionaries with the hopes of seeing a promised miracle. Okay, Mary had said that she would perform a miracle, so now people are coming from all over. There's a young man back here in the corner. He's in a yellow shirt. His name, what was your name, Don? What was it? Thomas, that's right. Thomas was just telling me before we started that his grandfather was there. And he says, my grandfather lived in Florence, but everybody had heard about the miracle that Mary was going to perform, and he went from Italy all the way over, that's a long way back in those days, all the way over to Fatima, and was there present to see all the miracles that happened on this day. So when Mary appears, a brief conversation takes place between Mary and Lucia. Mary states that she's willing to heal some of the people who are present, but only if, quote, they amend their lives and ask for forgiveness for their sins. And she adds, let them offend our Lord no more, for he is already much offended. Then what takes place is called the miracle of the sun. Okay, Catholics have all heard of this. I can tell you that I've talked to many people who are non-Catholics. I can't find anybody who's ever even heard of the miracle of the sun. In fact, I'm going to tell you something. I think that the miracle of the sun, following the life of Jesus, the resurrection, and all the things that happened there, got to be probably the most significant event in human history, because that day was transformative for humanity and for the church. And I have a book at home. It's a big fat thing like this. It's called, it's a history, it's chronological history events. So you get a bullet and it'll say, the birth of Caesar or something like that. And lots of stuff. It goes just too much information, actually. But I thought, I'm going to pull out this book and I'm going to see what they say about the miracle of the sun, because this is amazing. I mean, there's so much information in this book. I was just really curious. So I flipped to 1917 and I go to the spot. They don't even mention it. And I'm like, how can that be? How can we have this major event in history and it's not even in this book about the events of history, the major events of history? So here's what happened, in case you're not too familiar with the miracle of the sun and what happened on October 13th. Okay, though it had been drizzling all day, the clouds part and reveal the sun as an immense silver disk, shining with incredible intensity, but only for a few minutes, for a few moments. The sun then dims and begins to dance in the sky and spin rapidly like a gigantic circle of fire. All the while, the people who are assembled in this large field find that to stare directly into the sun not only does not blind them, it causes them no discomfort whatsoever. Shooting from the rim of the sun are red flames that cross the sky, and the light from these flames is reflected on the ground, the trees, and the very faces of the clothing of the people in the crowd. Brilliant hues of colors are seen by the people from the reflection of these rays. Approximately 10 minutes into this fantastic spectacle, with the people still able to stare directly into the sun then trembles and shakes and then plunges, zigzagging toward the earth as if it is going to crash into the earth. People cry out terrified, while others loudly confess their sins, believing their lives to be at an end. Some faint, others fall to their knees, begging for forgiveness. It's a moment more terrifying than any other for the crowd. As the sun is about to reach the earth and destroy all life on the planet, it quickly stops and then zigzags back to its place in the sky and returns to its original state. The miracle of the sun is over. The entire event, witnesses say later, has lasted about 12 minutes. Okay, so I'll just read you one quote. There's lots of quotes in there. It was reported, the atheists who were there were converted, the people who came, it was an amazing, amazing event. I'll just read you one quote of many from a person who was there. This guy's name is Alfredo de Silva Santos, and he said, "I can hardly find words to describe what followed. The sun began to move, and at a certain moment appeared to be detached from the sky and about to hurtle on us like a wheel of flame. My wife, we had been married only a short time, fainted. I fell on my knees, oblivious of everything, and when I got up, I don't know what I said. I think I began to cry out like the others." So the miracle of the sun it's impossible by natural means to explain the miracle of the sun. It was not registered at any observatory anywhere. It was not a natural phenomenon or of natural origin, and it affected equally both believers and unbelievers. Everyone, even atheists, witnessed this spectacle, and people in the countryside, as far away as 30 miles, also saw the miracle, thus ruling out some form of local mass hysteria. Many would point out later that this event matches a prediction made by Jesus in the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke, that in the last days, God would perform a solar miracle, what the Gospel describes as signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. With the exception of the resurrection of Jesus, it's the only time in history in which God gives the date and location of a coming miracle in order to prove the authenticity of the message that's associated with it. This date, in fact, is exactly 33 years to the day after Pope Leo XIII has heard Jesus and Satan in the chapel at the Vatican. So an incredible coincidence in history, Vladimir Lenin, at the same time this is happening, is crossing into Russia. He wants to make Russia into a communist country. Also at the same time, Bolsheviks are in Moscow, and they're seizing control of one of the great cathedrals of their city, called the Cathedral of Kazan, built by one of the czars. They desecrate the cathedral, but the miraculous icon of Kazan, a prized possession of the Russians and housed in the cathedral, is taken and swiftly removed by the faithful and taken to safety outside Russia. This icon later will be returned it will make its way to John Paul II. He will have it in his private chapel, and then later he will actually return it to Russia. So the great lesson in all of this so far is that sin itself causes division and disharmony. It's a kind of spiritual decay that we go through when sin happens. And the various afflictions of our world are brought about by these vices and by sin. The influenza epidemic, which is going on in Europe, continues to ravage, and it takes the lives of Jacinta and Francisco. Francisco and Jacinta, two of the three visionaries of Fatima, die from the influenza epidemic. And then 15 years later, after the death of Jacinta, again in 1951, Jacinta's grave is opened, and like St. Anthony Mary Claret, her body was found to be incorrupt. It hadn't decayed. So Lucia survives the influenza epidemic. Mary had said that she would live longer, but that the other two would die shortly after the apparitions of Fatima. And then she, Lucia, enters a convent in Spain as a postulant. In December of 1925, she receives an apparition of both Mary and the child Jesus together. During the course of this apparition, Mary says to Lucia that she promises salvation to those who will complete what is called the 5 First Saturdays devotion. This is one of my favorite devotions. I love this devotion a lot. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what it is. If you've never done it, I recommend it. The devotion consists of a person completing 4 simple things. It is to go to confession. You do each of these things, and you do it on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months. So think January through May. That would be, so the first Saturday of January, you would go to confession, you would go to Mass and receive communion, you would actually pray 1 mystery of the Rosary, that means 5 decades of the Rosary, and then you would meditate for 15 minutes on the 15 mysteries of the Rosary. So you would do that, and then you would do that for 5 consecutive months, okay? And all with the intention of making reparation to Mary for sin. Then finally, on June 13th of 1929, which is the 12th anniversary of the June apparition at Fatima, Mary appears again to Lucia, this time at her convent, and it's at this time that Mary says that she wants Russia to be consecrated to her Immaculate Heart in a special way. When Mary had mentioned this before, Lucia said, you know, we didn't know what Russia was. They were I think they were all 3 illiterate. They didn't know what Russia was. They thought Russia was a sinful woman. So when Mary had the very first time mentioned it to them, they will, okay, whatever, you know. They thought it was a sinful woman. Later they found out, oh, this is a whole country that we're talking about. Then Lucia is praying in the chapel in the convent, and Mary appears to her and says, the moment has come in which God asks the Holy Father, in union with all the bishops of the world, to make the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, promising to save it by this means. There are so many souls whom the justice of God condemns for sins committed against me, that I have come to ask for reparation. Sacrifice yourself for this intention and pray. So the consecration, really what she's asking is this. She doesn't say what it is the Pope has to say, just simply that he has to have the intention of consecrating Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. He needs to do it in union with the bishops of the world, not just himself. And then he has to do it with the intention of, for this particular intention. Okay, that's all that she's asking. In the future, there would be a few popes who actually make a consecration to Mary, but not in union with the bishops, and it wasn't actually in the way that Mary had asked. So in 1924, Lenin dies, and then Stalin takes over. Stalin is going to be the person who actually fulfills what Mary had said about the Ukraine, okay? During the early 1930s, the Ukraine would undergo one of the worst famines in history, what scholars believe to be a calculated effort by Joseph Stalin to suppress an independence movement from within the country in order to subdue the country and keep it strictly under Soviet domination. A man-made famine is created in the country, and as a result, up to 7 million people die of starvation in a period of only 1 year. Stalin believes that religion must be removed in order for the ideal communist society to be constructed. As a result, the government promotes atheism as a state belief system, sponsors atheistic education in schools, endorses anti-religious propaganda, founds atheist institutions like the Society of the Godless, and carries out a terror campaign against religious believers. In the 1930s, it becomes dangerous to be openly religious in Russia, as churches are destroyed or confiscated, and religion is violently persecuted. By 1939, The Russian Orthodox Church, which once had 54,000 parishes in 1917, now claims only hundreds, and tens of thousands of priests, monks, and nuns are persecuted or killed. Approximately 100,000 people are shot during the 1937 to 1938 purge. It's a really dangerous time to be in Russia. In Spain, Catholics fare no better than the Orthodox in Russia. During the Spanish Civil War, 11,000 priests and nuns are killed by the communist loyalists, and more than 20,000 churches, convents, and schools are desecrated and destroyed. Godlessness, though, never breeds harmony, and the world would stagger under the convulsions it was about to experience. The Virgin Mary's prophecy about a future war as a result of the sins of humanity was about to become a reality. So on the evening of January 25th, 1938, an enormous light appears in the sky across the globe. It's attributed to be an aurora borealis, but the largest aurora borealis since 1709. It goes across the globe. It's seen as far south as Australia. It knocks out radio transmissions in various countries. The New York Times states, "Aurora borealis startles Europe. People flee and call firemen." People thought that Parliament in London was on fire because the lights were so dramatic. So Lucia, a witness to the light in the heavens, says that this is the sign of the future war that is imminent. 10 days later, after these lights illuminate the sky, fulfilling the prediction at Fatima, Adolf Hitler takes command of the armed forces of Germany. And the following month, he begins his plan of world conquest by marching troops into Austria. The war that follows is devastating and catastrophic for all sides. We all know the date, December 7th, 1941. That's a famous date in our country's history. Japan attacks military outposts in the Pacific, one of them Pearl Harbor. The United States is thrown into a panic and it declares war on Japan the following day. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, a butler at the White House overhears Roosevelt and his aides in conversation discussing a possible invasion of the United States by Japan. They agree that following an invasion, the Japanese would never be able to overtake the entire mainland, and Japanese troops would never get as far as Chicago. This was scary. We look back on it with the safety of being in the future. At the time, it was terrifying. It was as terrifying as living through 9/11, in my opinion. So Hitler, by 1943, felt that he would have already taken England. He saw London as fairly close to, water. He could invade on the side, come in, take London, have England, and then continue his plan of world conquest. It wasn't going as he had planned. He hadn't been able to do this. The entire war was stalling, and he becomes desperate, and he comes up with a plan. During the midst of the war, he develops a plan to invade the Vatican, capture the Pope, and kill the cardinals. Hitler orders Karl Wolff, the SS commander for Italy, and a deputy to Himmler, to invade the Vatican as soon as possible and take the Pope captive, and then murder the cardinals. Pope Pius XII is alerted secretly of this plan, and on September 6th, calls the cardinals together to tell them of Hitler's plan. The minutes from this meeting indicate that the Pope had written a letter of resignation and hidden it in the Vatican to be used only if he is taken captive by the Nazis. He tells the cardinals where to find the letter in the case he is captured, and that those who survive are to escape to a neutral territory, then regroup and elect a new pope. The Swiss Guard is instructed not to resist with arms, but to do their best to hide important documents and artifacts from the Nazis. General Wolff, however, seeing that an invasion of the Vatican would create such an outcry that it would be political suicide, together with Major General Stahel, convinces Hitler not to go through with the plan. So by 1945, the tide has turned. The war is nearly over, but with a staggering cost, 50 million dead. The most viciously persecuted group are Jews. Catholics fare better. Of the roughly 20,000 priests who were in Germany when Hitler came to power, 14,364 are killed, imprisoned, or exiled. Japan, which is at war with the United States in the Pacific, is also losing its battle. They're resorting in desperation to suicide bombers called kamikaze. a name that means divine wind. The United States, on the other hand, has tested its first nuclear bomb, called Trinity, in the New Mexico desert. Ultimately, Trinity would prove to be more powerful than kamikaze. On August 6th of 1945, the United States drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima that levels every building within 1 mile of the center of the blast, with the exception of one structure, a parish house only 8 blocks from the center of the blast, in which 8 Jesuit priests are living and praying the rosary every day. Included in their prayers each day is the supplication given at Fatima, "Save us from the fires of hell." They're the only people to survive the atomic bomb within 4 square miles of the epicenter, and while other victims are incinerated in heat that reaches 10,000 degrees, these men do not even lose their hearing. Though scientists tell the Jesuits that they should have lived only 2 minutes due to radiation poisoning alone, they live healthy lives into the 1970s and are ultimately studied more than 200 times by scientists and medical doctors. In an ironic twist of fate, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor on the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the patroness of the United States. The following day, on the feast day itself, the United States had declared war on Japan. At the end of the war, Japan is forced to surrender to the United States on the eve of the Feast of the Assumption of Mary. The following day, the feast day itself, and actually the name of the church in Hiroshima, where the parish house was that was saved, the emperor declares to the Japanese people that they have accepted surrender. It's interesting to note that the great sign predicted at Fatima, that war was imminent, would be a great light in the heavens. This same war is concluded as another terrible light descends upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a light generated by the reactions found in the stars of heaven. So while most of Europe lies in ruins, and entire cities have actually been bombed beyond recognition, one country has passed through the war untouched. It's Portugal. The reason for this incredibly good fortune is that in 1938, the year before the war began, the country's bishops held a national procession to Fatima to consecrate the entire nation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This act granted the country special protection during the conflict. 1 out of every 12 Portuguese made a pilgrimage to Fatima on the anniversary of the first apparition. And in fact, in a letter to the Pope written by Lucia in 1940, so this is a year after the war had started, she says, "Our Lord promises a special protection to our country in this war due to the consecration of the nation by the Portuguese prelates to the Immaculate Heart of Mary as proof of the graces that would have been granted to other nations had they also consecrated themselves to her." So the consecration of Portugal to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1938 granted the entire nation special protection from the devastations of a war that took 50 million lives. This same incredible good fortune is available to you too. I personally have consecrated myself to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. We, my family, have made the consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. You can do the same thing, and you can consecrate yourself, your children, your family. We can do it as a community, as countries. And if you don't know there's a book called 33 Days to Morning Glory. This is a 33-day consecration. It's longer. Me and my family, what we did was I went onto the internet and I looked at all of these different consecrations. EWTN has one, then a couple other people, St. Maximilian Kolbe has one. You can download one and use that consecration. So in 1945, at the end of the war, the Soviet Union annexes and occupies the eastern portion of Austria by military troops. Their ultimate goal is the complete annexation of the entire country. Rather than fighting, though, the Austrians begin a massive prayer campaign, the largest in history, to rid the country of Soviet occupation. 10% of the country signs petitions pledging to live by the messages of Fatima, including praying the rosary every day. Suddenly, on the 38th anniversary of the first apparition at Fatima, so it was May 13th of 1955, the Soviets unexpectedly agree to withdraw their troops from the country. the only time the Soviet Union had vacated a country without either side firing a shot. The prayer campaign to rid the country of Soviet forces is seen as a miracle, and during the Thanksgiving ceremony in Vienna, all of the speeches attribute the victory to the Virgin of the Rosary. So during the rise of communism, communism is spreading. There's a tremendous amount of money being spent on on warfare, on military armaments and things of that sort. Something happens in the church that's really important in 1950. Pope Pius XII actually issues a brand new dogma called the Assumption of Mary. It's the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. And he states that after her earthly life, Mary was taken up, both body and soul, directly into heaven. Now, God would provide a confirmation of the new dogma with a repeat of the extraordinary Fatima miracle. 4 times during the week that he declares this dogma, the Pope witnesses the miracle of the sun, the same solar miracle seen by 70,000 people at Fatima while walking in the Vatican gardens. At 4 p.m. on October 30th of that year, during a walk in the Vatican gardens, he arrives at the statue of Our Lady of Lourdes and begins to see the miracle of the sun. He describes himself in his notes as awestruck as he watches the sun dance in the sky from left to right and back again. Staring directly into the sun neither damaged his eyes, nor did it bother him in any way. He wrote, "The sun, which was still quite high, looked like a pale, opaque sphere, entirely surrounded by a luminous circle." He wrote that he could look directly into the sun, quote, "without the slightest bother." He saw the same miracle on the 31st of October, again on November 1st, which was the day of the definition of the dogma of the Assumption, and then finally again on November 8th. He wrote that on other days, at about the same time, he tried to see if he could see the miracle of the sun, but he was unable to, saying, "I couldn't fix my gaze even for an instant." He confided this information to a number of Vatican cardinals, as well as Sister Pascalina Leonard, the nun in charge of papal apartments, and finally to handwritten notes that were eventually placed on display at the Vatican more than 50 years later. Pius believed that his witnessing of the miracle of the sun was confirmation that God was pleased with the promulgation of the new dogma. And it's interesting to note that the Pope issues the dogma of the Assumption of Mary 66 years after Pope Leo XIII hears Jesus grant the devil a century to try the church. So we're going to move forward. We're going to go to my hero. My hero is John Paul II. When I was younger and a teenager, they were more football players were my heroes, but John Paul II is my hero. In 1978, a little-known cardinal, Karol Wojtyła, he is elected pope, and he would choose the name John Paul II. He quickly condemns both communism and what he calls unbridled capitalism. He possesses an uncanny mix of talents and skills. He's an intellectual and a philosopher who's also a writer. He's gifted in diplomacy and possesses great energy and charisma. The following year, he travels to his native Poland, and as millions watch either in person or through television, he calls for religious tolerance and advocates for greater freedom and human rights. So the Pope, I'm going to read you one thing. I don't normally read this, but you know, he traveled, before he became Pope, he traveled through the United States, actually. And then both in the United States and in other places, he had some very stark words for our generation. This is one of them. "We must prepare ourselves to suffer great trials before long, such as will be demanded of us to be, such as will demand of us a disposition to give up even life and a total dedication to Christ and for Christ. With your prayer and my prayer, it is possible to mitigate this tribulation. But it is no longer possible to avert it, because only thus can the church be effectively renewed. How many times has the renewal of the church sprung from blood? This time too it will not be otherwise. We must be strong and prepared, and trust in Christ and his mother, and be very, very assiduous in praying the rosary." So on May 13th of 1981, it's the 64th anniversary of Mary's first appearance at Fatima. John Paul II is shot in St. Peter's Square. He's rushed to the hospital. He's saved. He actually has unusual blood type, And the hospital should have had the blood type, but they ran out. The Pope actually was going to die. There was going to be no survival because they didn't have the blood that he needed. One of the two bullets actually entered right here, and the doctor later who operated on him said that the trajectory of the bullet showed that it should have severed the major artery, but it went around the major artery, sparing his life. The doctor couldn't figure it out. How could that be? People in the hospital finding out that the Pope is there, and they're looking for this particular blood type. One person steps forward who's a worker at the hospital, says, I have that blood type, I can donate blood. And then another person, and actually some of these people were not even scheduled to be there that day, but they went and they substituted for somebody else who needed somebody, so that miraculously they were the right people. And they all donated blood. There was enough blood to save the Pope's life. The Pope lives, and he survives to actually carry out the consecration that Mary is asking of us. When he survives and he goes back to the Vatican, either he's in the hospital or he's at the Vatican. I don't know which is right. But he asked for the documents that pertain to Fatima. And he is brought the documents and he reads them and he realizes what we are missing in all of this is a Pope who will consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary together with all the bishops throughout the world. He decides this is what we're going to do. So he writes, he said Mary had never said exactly what the words were that needed to be said, so he writes his own text of what the consecration will be. He tells the bishops that this is what we're going to do. It's going to be March 25th of 1984. But in the meantime, in 1981, another thing happens. In communist Yugoslavia, 6 children in a village called Medjugorje claim to be receiving apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And the miracle of the sun, witnessed first at Fatima and then by Pope Pius XII, is now seen almost daily by pilgrims of all nationalities and religions. Among the many intriguing statements allegedly made by Mary at the site is the prediction, Russia will be the country that glorifies God the most. Communist authorities try to suppress the gatherings and harass the children, even threatening to kill them. But the numerous healings and other miraculous phenomena that take place there only draw larger crowds. So the Pope writes the text of the consecration. There's a famous photograph of him in St. Peter's. He's before a statue of Mary, and he's reading the consecration. It's March 25th of 1984. There's a person who is one of his good friends. He's also a bishop, Bishop Hunalika. Okay, he's a bishop of countries of the East. And he has decided that he too is going to do the consecration. But he wants to do something special. He is going to go not only into Russia to make the consecration of Russia from within Russia, and he's not even just going to go to Moscow to make the consecration there. He's going to get into the Kremlin, and he's going to make the consecration from the Kremlin. So he gets a passport, sort of dresses like a tourist, has a bag with him, and he flies over to Russia and arrives at 4 o'clock in the morning. He does this on purpose. The Russian people are very suspicious. He knows that he could be detained. If he's found out, it's very possible they'll just jail him, and who knows how long he would be in prison. So he wants the least amount of problems possible. He arrives at 4 o'clock in the morning. The person who is there asks him what he wants. The customs, and he says, well, I'm here just to visit the beautiful city. And he says, the customs officer is actually kind of a snarly guy, and he says he's suspicious, and he keeps asking questions. Now he wants to detain him. He just doesn't believe that this guy, there's a hunch. He goes to the telephone. This man, the customs official, calls his superior, but it's 4 o'clock in the morning. His superior is asleep. The phone rings in his house and rings in his house. The guy doesn't get up to pick it up. He comes back and he starts talking to Bishop Hunalika again. He's asking him all sorts of questions. And then he goes back and picks up the phone a second time, starts calling more people. He makes multiple phone calls, can't get anybody in the middle of the night, finally comes back to him and says, fine, go. So he comes in and he meets another person. This other person starts, well, just a minute, you can't go. Where are you going with this bag? Oh, well, I'm just here to visit your wonderful country. Well, so he has this conversation, and he has to sort of butter up this other person. This guy's a military officer, And eventually, the guy opens up and he sees miraculous medals on the inside. He picks them up, a fistful of these. He says, "What are these?" He says, "Oh, well, these are souvenirs from Rome. You can take some if you'd like." Well, he says, "Okay, you can move on." So he takes his bag and off he goes. He has a hotel in Moscow. He checks into his hotel. The morning of the 25th, he goes to the Kremlin. He's actually only detained briefly, and then he gets into the Kremlin, and he goes to Red Square, where there is the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael. The Archangel Michael plays a pivotal role in this whole story. And the other thing that's interesting is the Russians, when they took over, when the communists took over, they desecrated most of the churches. There are videos online and pictures that you can see of them actually dynamiting beautiful cathedrals that are works of art. And you can see them crumbling like this in black and white still photographs. But in Red Square, there were 3 cathedrals, and they left them alone. They said, well, these are really actually beautiful architecture. Let's leave them, and we'll turn them into museums, which is what they did. So these 3 cathedrals are actually still standing. The first one is called the Cathedral of the Archangel Michael. It's a spectacular white stone church with gold dome located next to the Kremlin Palace. He's questioned only briefly and then enters without incident. He goes to the main altar to make the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. His heart is pounding profusely. He's scared. He could be detained if he's found out. He pulls from his bag a copy of Pravda, the Russian newspaper. Pravda means truth, okay? But buried within the newspaper is the text that he has smuggled of the consecration itself. He enters into prayer and reads slowly the text of the consecration, and after this, he remains in prayer for some time and then leaves the building. Following this consecration, he walks to the Cathedral of the Annunciation, across the plaza, and repeats the consecration at the altar of the Mother of God. Then, having smuggled into the church both wine mixed with water in an empty aspirin bottle and a bag of unconsecrated hosts, he finds a secluded place and says Mass using the text of the Feast of the Annunciation. It's interesting, the Russians were communist and atheist. They were officially an atheist country, and yet in Pravda that day, they had the biblical text of the Annunciation. He opens up his Pravda, which, as I said before, means truth, and he uses part of what's written in Pravda in order to say the Mass. He then during the offertory, he says that during that time he renewed the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and then this Mass, more than any other in his life, he said, left him shaken. He said, communism and all evils seemed so small, all dangers were so little, they didn't exist anymore. Following this, he goes and crosses the Kremlin, passes a large building chiseled with the words, "Communism will triumph." And he arrives at the tomb of Lenin, guarded by a group of stern-looking soldiers who no doubt want to pick a fight with somebody. Lenin is mummified. He's kept inside of his own mausoleum. You can look through the glass and see actually his face. If you Google, actually you could Google it and you'll see the face, you'll see him through the glass. This is where he goes. He walks up to the glass, and there's a guard there who is literally 2 paces away. But he opens up his Pravda, pretends like maybe he's a good communist reading his Pravda, and very, very quietly, facing Lenin, he says the consecration of Russia to Mary. Then he closes his newspaper, he prays for a while, he leaves. He goes back to his hotel, he leaves the country a free man, and what happens shortly after this is a series of events that is startling. In very quick succession, an amazing series of events ultimately topples communism in the Soviet bloc. The following year, in fact, almost exactly a year to the day after the consecration is made, a communist technocrat named Mikhail Gorbachev is elected head of the Soviet Union. There's that name, Michael, again. So Mikhail Gorbachev is not elected in order to make any, the only thing that he says in his opening speech is that he wants to heal the ailing economy. The Russians were constantly trying to fix their economy, but they had a bad system, so that's why it never got fixed. 2 years later, in 1987, April 26th, the Virgin Mary appears again near Khrushchev, Ukraine. You remember that there were 22 people out mowing fields, and she gave predictions there, okay? This time, it is to a 12-year-old girl, and she appears above the same church where she had appeared in 1914. More apparitions follow, and unlike the others, everyone who travels to Khrushchev sees Mary at the time of the apparition. This is very unusual. 500,000 people ended up going there and seeing Mary. In the ensuing months, 500,000 people of every major religion testify to having seen Mary. One apparition is even televised on Ukrainian television for all to see. She tells those who are gathered there, "I have come to comfort you and to tell you that your suffering will soon come to an end. Ukraine will become an independent state." So the Pope, meanwhile, is unsure that he has made the consecration right. He writes a letter to Lucia. He asks, "Please pray for me, and if you get communication from Jesus to indicate whether or not I've done the consecration right, let me know." She writes him back a letter. She says, "Yes, you have done it right. Our Lady will keep her promises." She's saying that the consecration is going to topple Russia, and it's just a matter of time now. Suddenly and almost without warning, the Berlin Wall falls in November of 1989, and citizens pass freely between Western and Eastern Germany. The same year, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania become independent states. Then, on August 24th, 1991, 4 years after the apparition at Khrushchev, Ukraine also becomes an independent state. So in 1914, Mary had said that the Ukraine would suffer under Russian rule for nearly 80 years, and then it would be free again. 75 years after this prediction, Ukraine is once again free. Then, in one of the most dramatic events in history, I still remember my mother crying out. It was Christmas Day, and she yells out, "Gorbachev is on TV!" And I was thinking, well, I don't know, why is that so important? You know, are we supposed to be happy about that? And he's doing something with the Russians. Well, what does that mean exactly? So Gorbachev comes out, and he has this surprise news conference. People weren't expecting it. And he says that he is dissolving what is the Soviet Union. He says that Russia and its satellite countries have now been, quote, freed politically and spiritually. He continues stating that these freedoms, including freedom of worship, have become a reality, and that the Russian people, quote, are living in a new world. So we come full circle. We find that in the very beginning, Jesus had warned us about this great storm. There was an archbishop who was supposed to promote this devotion. He didn't, and what happened was that this great storm came. And what was missed by the one archbishop was finally solved by the Pope and all the bishops throughout the world who, in union together, made this consecration. They fulfilled what was asked of at Fatima. So I will close by saying that on the Christmas evening, just after 7:30 p.m., the Soviet hammer and sickle flag, which was a symbol of oppression for millions of people during most of the 20th century, was finally lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. It's no coincidence that each of these events happens on specific feast days, and in this one, it's almost as if God himself was giving us a Christmas present. Thank you all for coming.